Let's begin our understanding of the history of ancient Western philosophy with the Milesians. Philosophy, as we know, begins, or as far as we know, begins in Miletus, an Ionian city on the Mediterranean shore of what is now known as Turkey. It's a great port with a large carrying trade. Miletus served not only Greece, but also Egypt and Babylonia, then at the height of their culture. The thought of the Milesian philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, shows traces of Egyptian and even Babylonian as well as Greek influence. If it's true that Thales, for example, predicted a solar eclipse that occurred in 585 BC, he must have been born towards the latter part of the 7th century. Of course, the prediction really just is based, or the date, 585 BC, considering that that was his greatest contribution, supposedly, became the basis for the determination of his age. For that matter, Anaximander appears to have been his slightly younger contemporary, and Anaximenes, a younger contemporary of both Thales and Anaximander. Of course, we're not really sure about who Thales was, but he seems to be that type of person where stories revolve. Let's look at two of the stories about Thales that really preoccupied our story of understanding of ancient philosophy. Let's look at Plato's Theaetetus. They say that once when Thales was gazing upwards while doing astronomy, he fell into a well, and that a witty and charming Thracian serving girl made fun of him for being eager to know the things in the heavens, but failing to notice what was just behind him and right by his feet. Of course, having fallen into a well is a symbol of a philosopher not always in the world, but Simon Critchley, in an essay about who is a philosopher in the New York Times, if I'm not mistaken, presented a very interesting commentary about this story and how a philosopher understands time. And I suggest you look for it. Another story is from Aristotle's Politics, and let's read this one. The story goes that when they were reproaching him for his poverty, supposing that philosophy is useless, he learned from his astronomy that the olive crop would be large. Then, while it was still winter, he obtained a little money and made deposits on all the olive presses, both in Miletus and in Chios. And since no one bid against him, he rented them cheaply. When the time came, suddenly many requested the presses all at once, and he rented them out on whatever terms he wished, and so he made a great deal of money. In this way, he proved that philosophers can easily be wealthy if they wish, but this is not what they are interested with. And of course, here you see not just theoretical wisdom, but also its practicality. Every history of philosophy begins with Thales, and of course records with proper solemnity his opinion that the primary ingredient of all things, or stoikeion, is water. The primary ingredient of everything is water. Of course, every student studying philosophy is shocked by this one. If you go through the history of philosophy, not until we reach Plato and Aristotle will you find yourselves in a world recognizably like your own. A world whose science, law, and logic are of a type our experiences resonate with. But we need to understand that the pronouncements of philosophers like Thales are usually responses to questions, whether or not the questions are explicitly put. If Thales claimed that the primary ingredient of all things is water, perhaps it's interesting to see what his question was. And presumably, the question of Thales was, what is the source of all things? Or what is the primary ingredient or the stoikeion of all things? What is the stoikeion of all things? This seems but little progress. Of course, we started with water, which was a naive answer. But to arrive at the question, what is the source or primary ingredient of all things, is another naive question. In fact, in philosophy, as in anything, the question is very important. Questions, we need to be reminded, are not statements. They're not declarations. Questions do not express propositions. As such, because they're not statements, questions are neither true nor false. But interestingly, every question assumes that certain propositions are true. Questions arise in a context of beliefs and attitudes, and they turn upon their source, transforming their own assumptions. Thales's question, understood through its answer, assumes at least two things, which is worthy of our reflection. If the question is what is the source of all things, or what is the primary ingredient of all things, it assumes two things. One, that question assumes that everything has a source, and that the source of all things is one thing, or singular. It's very interesting that from that question alone, we see two of the presuppositions of Thales, that there is a source and that this source is one. The universe, as it is understood by Thales, is bound to a single principle. And that single principle is the primordial water. And that primordial water can be understood by means of a singular relation. Primordial water is arrived at by means of derivation. Nature is one whole thing with unchanging ways of its own to be accounted for in terms of a unitary principle of explanation. Something like the Harry Potter's Sorcerer's Stone, which basically says that there is an order in nature which is accessible to us, which is also in accordance with the Greek understanding of the cosmos, no? And that the single principle, order, can be comprehended by the mind, accessible to the mind, if you will. Aristotle explains the attempt of the first philosophers this way. Of those who first pursued philosophy, the majority believed that the only principles of all things are principles in the form of matter, for that of which all existing things are composed, and that from which they originally come to be, and that into which they finally perish. The substance persisting, but changing in its attributes. This, they state, is the element and principle of the things that are. For there must be one or more natures from which the rest come to be, while it is preserved. However, they do not all agree about how many or what kinds of such principles there are. But Thales, the founder of this kind of philosophy, stated it to be water. This is why he declared that the earth rests or floats on water. He may have gotten this idea, and here it's quite interesting to observe how Aristotle tried to reconstruct Thales's thinking. He might have gotten this idea from seeing that the nourishment of all things is moist, and that even the hot itself comes to be from these and lives on these. The principle of all things is that from which they come to be. Getting this idea from this consideration, and also because the seeds of all things have a moist nature, and water is the principle of the nature of moist things. The details of Thales's worldview are not known with any accuracy, sadly. He seems to have supposed that the earth is like a clot that floats on a vast body of water. The liquid itself, he must have thought to be unbounded. Unbounded. This is a word we will see again in Anaximander. Without boundary. Aperon. The unbounded is not to be understood as infinite. It's not the infinite, since the concept of the infinite had not yet been invented, but rather during this time, but rather must be understood as indefinite. That the unbounded is to be understood as indefinite, not infinite. This conception of the unbounded primordial water is obviously not Greek. It is found in the myths of the great river civilizations of Egypt and Babylonia, but is most famously preserved to us right now in the book of Genesis. Remember, even if you read Genesis 1, chapter 1 and onwards, you'd see that the Spirit was hovering over primordial waters, described even in the Hebrew as tohu bohu. The world itself was probably thought by Thales to have grown from this primordial liquid. Perhaps even as Aristotle suggested, as an animal grows from the moist seed. Thales thought that the primordial water was alive, and its life the source of motion. It seems that to be alive is to be capable of spontaneous movement, like water. And this may have been the reason Thales chose water as his primordial stuff. For water is the ancient symbol of life. Thales, no doubt, though thought that it is life, thought that in the living liquid, in the moving liquid, there was no distinction between its life and its liquidity. If you like this content, please subscribe and like the YouTube channel Samo't sa simula. These notes came from Greek philosophy, Thales to Aristotle, edited by Reginald Allen, and the Pre-Socratic Reader by edited by Patricia Curd. Thank you very much for your attention.